Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending FSU's 12th Annual South Asian and Cultural Studies Conference. My name is John Mayo. I'm a faculty member in the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy. The theme of this year's conference is Resilience and Renewal, Tradition, Innovation, and Media Futures in South Asia. The conference organizers are pleased to again welcome participants from South Asia as well as from other regions of the world. Before introducing our keynote speaker, I wish to thank the College of Communication and Information, the College of Social Sciences and Public Policy, and the Center for Global Engagement's Engage Your World speaker series. I also want to thank the Ruth K. and Shepard Broad Foundation of Miami for funding this afternoon's program through the International Affairs Leadership Lectureship it established at FSU 19 years ago. Our keynote speaker this afternoon is Dr. Michael Ogden. He is Dean, as you see on the screen, Dean Emeritus of Zayed University College of Humanities and Social Sciences in Dubai. Dr. Ogden is an accomplished teacher, scholar, storyteller, and documentary filmmaker. He is from Oregon and a descendant of the New Person and Sashes tribe. He is from Oregon and earned a BA in Communication Arts from George Fox University. He then served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Fiji for 2 years. He then earned a PhD in political science at the University of Hawaii, concentrating on development economics, technology, and alternative futures, which you'll hear about in his lecture. Dr. Ogden's academic career began concurrently at the University of Hawaii's Department of Communication, and the East-West Center for Pacific Island Studies. In 2000, he joined the faculty at Central Washington University's Department of Communication, where for 15 years he taught media production and directed a film studies program. In 2015, he was appointed professor of media production and storytelling at Zayed University's College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Subsequently, he was named the project's dean, a position he held until just last year. The lives and futures of indigenous peoples in the United States and around the world have been the hallmarks of Dr. Ogden's teaching, research, and filmmaking throughout his career. In that career, he has been guided by the seventh generation principle, which, he explained to me, is an indigenous philosophy attributed to the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Confederacy. It teaches that every decision we make today should lead to sustainable world, healthy relationships for at least 7 years. This applies to stewardship of our environment, to community well-being, and to the preservation of cultural traditions. It also applies directly to resilience and renewal, the themes of our conference, and not coincidentally, to the title of Dr. Ogden's lecture, which is on the screen. Please join me in welcoming him to FSU.
Kitsiyaya, and thank you for being here. I'm really happy to see you all here. So, I was trying to figure out if the person that you were talking about was actually me or not. It makes me sound a lot better than maybe I feel that I really deserve. But thank you for that. I want to do something that is a little bit of an experiment. But I also want to first do is to acknowledge those who are watching the live stream. Thank you for being here with us. I know that it's probably a great time divide for you, but I'm happy you're here. So this is the thought experiment I want you to do. And that is, close your eyes, if you're comfortable, and listen. Notice what you hear. My voice, certainly. Maybe someone rustling next to you or behind you. A hum of the air conditioning system. But what you're hearing is a kind of silence. You can open your eyes now, but hold on to that feeling. As a high school senior, my world was, and still is, I still think of myself as a high school senior, is built on stories, coyote stories mostly. But when I was assigned to read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, what stayed with me was the story that she opened with rather than the science that she exposed. A story of a town where animal life simply vanished. No bird songs, no buzzing insects, no croaking frogs, no tadpoles, no fish. Just an eerie, unnatural, and quite disquieting spring without a voice. That book was a prophecy. And it helped launch the modern U.S. environmental movement. For an indigenous farm boy like myself, I was also profoundly drawn to the issues of foresight and how futures can destroy or be destroyed quietly, long before we even recognize that it's happening. Years later, I watched the 2017 Hindi film, Kadvihala, Bitter Wind in English. And I felt that same chill of recognition. There are no apocalyptic special effects in this film. Just a drought-stricken village, a blind farmer trying to keep his son alive while crops fail and debts increase. All the while, trying to hold off a debt collector who himself is a climate refugee from a state suffering from catastrophic floods. What struck me was that Kadvihala is not about some distant future. It's about our present, already arrived. So the question at the heart of this keynote is this: how do we think about a crisis that doesn't arrive at once, but creeps up gradually? Nothing spectacular, just barely noticed thinning of our future. Not the future, by the way, but the narrowing of the present until there is no future. My argument today is simple, but I hope also a little bit radical. The climate crisis is at its core a crisis of time. However, our hegemonic civilization imposes only a single dominant timeline, one of progress, growth, and extraction, while rendering other civilizational temporalities as invisible, inferior, or obsolete. This hegemony impacts the global subaltern in ways that systematically silence their voices, devalues their knowledge, and forecloses their futures, while presenting this exclusion as natural and unavoidable. So, can we avoid a dystopian future? Probably. But to get there, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to look at the diagnosis of the dominant temporal framework. Then the antidote drawn from indigenous and karmic temporalities. Then we will see some evidence from South Asian indigenous documentaries and conclude with a call to action for our work in media, cultural studies, and climate resistance. So let's stay with Carson and Kadvihawa for just a moment longer, because together they bookend the world that I'm trying to talk about. Carson's fable on her evidence about the crisis gives us a world that suddenly is empty of sound. The shock is immediate. People recognize this. Something obviously is wrong. We need to fix it. And we kind of did. We banned DDT. Crisis resolved, maybe. Kadvihawa gives us a very different horror, a slow erosion of options. The rains don't fall once. They just keep failing. The debt doesn't disappear. It accumulates. The seasons become unreliable. It's less like an event and more like a permanent condition. Carson's fable is framed as a warning about a possible future from the 1960s. Kadvihawa looks like and feels like a documentary of the present. And so, when does a warning become obvious? And when does future risk become lived reality? When you put Silent Spring and Kadvihawa side by side, you can see that the warnings didn't vanish. They were just absorbed into the body of everyday life. And I know that's kind of a heavy thing to start a keynote with. I apologize for that. But still, what did we do with these warnings? How did we move from shock and urgency to a culture that can watch climate disaster after climate disaster and just continue doom scrolling? Now, if we zoom out, we can see that the journey from Silent Spring to Kadvihawa is not a straight line of increasing awareness. It's something more troubling. From the 1960s onwards, environmental warnings saturated scientific discourse and popular culture with films of potential apocalypse. Anyone ever see Soylent Green? Yeah, okay, Soylent Green. But culturally, something else began to happen in the latter decades. Hollywood gave us Gordon Gekko's Greed is Good, while William Foster in Falling Down exposed late capitalism's promise of stability while fostering structural disposition, resentment, and social fragmentation. By the 2000s, climate documentaries like Inconvenient Truth and The 11th Hour moved into the mainstream, yet they were seen as just more content in a media echo chamber that quickly autoplayed the next YouTube short. I know I'm mixing my metaphors, sorry. The problem is not a lack of information, because the science has been pretty darn painfully clear about climate data. In fact, it was predicted that if the Earth reaches a 2.2 increase, we will be the hottest planet since 300 million years ago, when the dinosaurs were stomping around. That's kind of scary. I don't want to get stomped on by a dinosaur. But what I'm trying to get to here is the deeper problem. And that is that the warnings are absorbed into a temporal logic that says, act now for profit. Delay action on everything else, and trust some vague future technology to solve the problem. Okay? It's not my problem, that's science problem. That's why I call this the arc of distraction and assimilation. We hear the warnings, we fold them into a system that is structurally unable to respond. We're not dealing with ignorance either, far from it. We're dealing with a culture very good at hearing warnings and filing them away as something scientists will fix. Now, to understand why that happens, I think we need to look under the hood of the social machinery. And to do that, I introduce you to Anthony Giddens. He was a sociologist of modernity, and he describes our condition as a runaway world. Modernity, in his view, is not just faster, it systematically dislocates us from the slower cyclical rhythms that used to govern our lives, anchor our lives. Our institutions, from markets to media, are designed around acceleration. In this runaway world, the present keeps shrinking. Common sense becomes deeply short-term. It feels normal for markets to demand quick returns, for politicians to only think about their election cycle, and for media to move on between commercials. We stop seeing that as a choice and start experiencing it as reality itself. Giddens gives us the dynamic, but Gramsci, who we'll talk about later, helps us to see how these dynamics become taken for granted. It's a kind of temporal hegemony that makes it hard to imagine slowing down and lingering on preferred alternative futures. In Giddens' runaway world, the present keeps speeding up because it's frictionless. There's nothing to slow it down. While our futures keep getting shorter and thinner. Long-term thinking feels almost unnatural. So, from the perspective of living systems, that's dangerous. So Real Miller and Roberto Poli were scholars of anticipatory systems theory. It's a kind of sometimes tucked in there with future studies. But they're describing how individuals, communities, and societies act in the present based on their expectations of their preferred future, whether they're working for it or not. In fact, all living systems, from forests and oceans to immune systems, can anticipate. That's sort of a form of futuring. They too model possible futures and learn to adjust their behavior accordingly, but we're stretching the environment where they're having a harder time to rein in. In fact, what's striking about our current global system is that it has built an economy that still rewards the opposite of what we need to do to confront climate change. As Andrew Forrest pointed out at the World Economic Forum in Davos this last week, he stated that we risk being those businesses and political leaders who knew the planet's limits and elected to cross them anyway. It's not just unwise to break from an anticipatory systems perspective, that is a pathology. It's not just unwise to break the laws of complex life. If your system disables your ability to look ahead, you are actively undermining your own survival. When we talk about the climate crisis, we're not only talking about emissions, we are talking about a civilization that has lost its anticipatory balance. Okay, again, I got heavy. Sorry about that. But so far, we have a runaway world that accelerates the present, a pathology of anticipation that rewards short-term thinking, and a new media ecosystem that seems to turn even existential threats into background noise. The result is a profound crisis of temporal imagination. Our dominant hegemonic culture, or cultural story at least, treats time as linear, single, and short-term. Within that frame, it becomes very difficult to imagine responsibilities extending beyond your own lifetime, or coexisting with multiple temporalities, or honoring non-human scale of time, like deep time. The climate crisis is not a technical problem to be solved by better models or better science. It's a mismatch between the time horizon of our institutions and the time horizon of living systems we inhabit. But this temporal logic did not appear out of whole cloth. It has a history, and that history is deeply entangled with colonialism. Anthropologist Johannes Fabian gave us a powerful concept, the denial of co-evalness, the denial of being able to exist together in the same space and time. This denial of co-evalness acts as a mechanism by which the other is placed, or the other society is presented in comparison with modern time. In other words, indigenous and colonized peoples are treated as if they exist only in the past, rather than as with us in the present. He shows how historically Western anthropology placed people it studies, the natives, the tribes, the primitives, not just in different space, but in different times. Europe and America is modern, developed now. Indigenous and colonized people, however, were cast as locked in an earlier stage of development, existing as living museums of humanity's past. This temporal distancing is what Fabian calls the coloniality of time. It's not just about domination of land and labor, it's the domination of if and when you are allowed to exist in the present. Once you see that, it becomes clear why indigenous knowledge is so often treated as ancient wisdom, traditional beliefs, or folklore, easy to pass off, but rather than being contemporary, evolving, futures relevant knowledge. The message is, your time is past, our time is now. This denial of co-evalness is one of the deep structures that underpins temporal hegemony. It clears the way for a single linear modernity moving at high speed in which other times, indigenous time, sacred time, ecological time, can be ignored or appropriated. So if we pair Fabian's insight with Gramsci's concept of hegemony, we start to now see how this becomes a rigged temporal system. So how many of you know about Gramsci? Okay, good. So Gramsci was a very interesting scholar, especially his prison diaries were very interesting reads, sometimes a little bit long. But what Gramsci was talking about was the idea of hegemony. It's about power and how power works, not just through force, but through the shaping of common sense. The kind of logic that makes people shrug their shoulders and say, it is what it is. We just accept that hegemony. The hegemonic common sense states that economic growth must be continuous, extraction is normal, and sacrificing long-term futures for short-term gain is just how the world works. It is what it is. This is hegemony of short-termism, a temporal hegemony. I'll illustrate this by using the 2008 film Wanted. Any of you see that? The film? Okay, I was going to make an Angelina Jolie joke, but I'll move on from there. Okay, so in Wanted, the film is about the loom of fate, okay? And it is said to weave the names of people who must die to preserve the world order. The loom of fate tells everyone that destiny is written into the fabric of the universe. Then comes the big reveal. The loom was rigged. Yeah, the future everyone was obeying was being quietly edited by those in control for money, for power, and without remorse. That's Gramsci with special effects. Okay. Temporal hegemony is a rigged future made to feel inevitable. Our current temporal regime works in the same way. But underneath those phrases are very real decisions about whose futures are expendable and whose futures are preferred. The core diagnosis then, we are living inside a rigged temporal system, one that in the present devours the future and calls it progress. So the question is, what might a counter-hegemonic temporal framework work like? Well, we have a runaway world, a crisis of anticipation, a colonial and hegemonic temporal order. Not good. But how do we step off this rigged path and into a different temporal reality? Again, Rachel Carson comes to teach us how to develop temporal literacy, the ability to act across timescales for far longer than a single human lifetime. Geological time is evolutionary time. Tidal and seasonal rhythms are intergenerational continuity. Carson describes more than forests and ocean environments. She trains us to inhabit time differently, and I suggest that's precisely the ethical precondition for temporal sovereignty. Temporal sovereignty is the right and the responsibility of communities to define their own relationship to time and futurity. Temporal sovereignty is anchored in specific practices and principles. Here I want to introduce 3 of them as navigational tools. The first is a compass, the 7 generations principle. The second one, the terrain, is dharmic understanding of cyclical time and what I call Sanskrit futures. And then finally, the map, a simple 3P framework that describes how futures operate. So let's check out the compass. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is one of the oldest continuous functioning democratic alliances in the world, uniting 6 indigenous nations across what is now northeastern US and southeastern Canada. The Confederacy has governed itself for centuries through principles of collective responsibility and deep time accountability. At the heart of this governance is the 7 generations principle. Leaders are obliged to consider how today's decisions will affect people living many generations into the future. It is a politics explicitly designed to prevent the present from consuming the future. So the 7 generation principle is often summarized this way. When you make a decision today, you are accountable to descendants 7 generations into the future. If we assume that one human generation is roughly 25 years, that's a decision horizon of nearly 175 years. That's the time difference between us now here and our ancestors in the mid-1800s. When our descendants look back at our actions, will they see these future generations in the 22nd century looking at whether we turned towards life or turned away? It's not a slogan, it's a governance ethic, a way of forcing the present decision makers to think in multi-century consequences rather than political cycles, and to guard against the present quietly eating all possible alternative futures. Here I'm using the 7 generations principle as a critical lens. If Fabian and Gramsci help us to see how time has been colonized and made hegemonic, the 7 generations principle provides a way to decolonize time, to re-anchor our decisions in longer relational horizons. However, a compass is only as good as the land that you are in, so you can figure out where you're going. So that's where we go next. Dharmic philosophies teach that time is not straight, but a living tapestry, cyclical, spiraled, rhythmic, and ethically alive. Through karma, ethical causality, and dharma, relational responsibility, every action becomes a thread linking ancestors, living beings, and generations yet to be born. Sanskrit Futures grows out of this worldview, where the future is not something that we conquer or control. It is something we tend, balance, and remain accountable to and accountable for. The past is seen as a living resource, not something left behind and forgotten. Our future unfolds in relationship to karmic, ecological, ancestral, and inhabited time, rather than as a timeless, empty slate. The emphasis on the interdependence, obligations to land, water, and more than human kin, and renewal as rebalancing, not endless escalation. Through Sanskrit Futures, I'm naming a broad family of temporal sensibilities rooted in this indigenous karmic terrain. A shorthand for futures thinking grounded in Dharmic South Asian temporalities. When setting the Haudanso Sa Ni compass down in this terrain, something powerful happens. The 7 generations principle becomes not an imported idea, but a translational bridge from Turtle Island to South Asia, from the Longhouse to the Himalayan villages, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mannar. So here we are now with the 3 Ps. The South Asian documentaries that we will be exploring in part 3 present 3 reoccurring qualities, the 3 Ps that help map Sanskrit futures. The first, polycentric. Polycentric futures have multiple centers of authority, influence, or meaning that interact without a single dominant core. There is no single center of power or hegemonic worldview. Again, last week, speakers at the World Economic Forum presented a conclusion. Due to recent ruptures, the world is now truly, genuinely multipolar. So the global system centered on an unchallenged hegemonic political and economic system fixated on unwavering timelines of progress is starting to fracture. The second one is polymorphic. Futures that accept that the map is polyglot. Not just in English, polyglot. Knowledge appears not only as facts, data, and policy, but as ritual, storytelling, art, seasonal practice, and lived experience, rather than any single privileged mode of knowledge. These are multimodal archives of future survival skills. And finally, polyvalent. Polyvalent futures acknowledge that the same place on our map can hold both risk and, simultaneously, possibility. Communities are vulnerable and agentic, bearing risk while actively shaping their own futures through adaptive practices. They may be vulnerable to climate change and at the same time actively shaping adaptive futures through knowledge, creativity, care, possession, multiple values functioning as accomplices simultaneously. Together, these 3 Ps describe a different map of possible futures. Not a single road to development, but many paths, each grounded in a different center of knowledge and obligation. Well, what if we try to bring this down a little bit? Now, I know it's kind of weird in a keynote to have poetry, but Lakota artist Kanupa Hanska Luger writes about time as a line that spans across generations. He says, "There is a line that spans across time. This line is recorded, is the record of our continuous existence, woven into the fabric of our being. But this line, through tension or abrasion or brute force, has been cut. The edges are shredded, unraveling. In order to reconnect to our past, we must take up that broken line with both hands and thread it into our present to weave us into the future. That phrase, take up the broken lines with both hands, is for me the mandate of temporal sovereignty. The brute force that cut the line is everything that we've talked about thus far: colonial conquest, extractive capitalism, hegemonic short-termism. Our work is not to expose the violence, but to repair the line, to reweave severed histories back into living practice, to restore obligations to the seventh generation, to insist that the indigenous and local timescales are valid and essential guides. So far, I've outlined the architecture of the argument. But temporal sovereignty is not about abstraction. It's an active verb, practiced, embodied, and enacted. Across South Asia, documentarians, rural communities, and environmental awareness are already doing some of this work. They show us what it looks like to gather the broken lines, the broken threads, and rebraid the past into the present, and then weave us back into the preferred relational futures and model temporal accountability in the face of accelerating crises. Now, I'm introducing you now to the films. We will examine 3 South Asian documentaries that function as Sinkadoshi. If you don't know what Sinkadoshi means, it's a sample of life that represents the whole of life in Asia. That's a big draw, but you know, that's what it is. So we will be looking at indigenous pathfinders delivering possible future ancestral cartographies, different maps. Each reveals communities reasserting their own temporalities and how these temporalities widen the horizon of what futures are possible, and, I would argue, demonstrate the practice of temporal sovereignty. We'll look at 3 pathways of holding the future open, which is important, because if we close the future, we no longer have one. The first is the path of fluidity, or fluid continuity, the path of sacred permanence, and the path of deep time advocacy. As we move through these short clips, I invite you to watch not only what is happening, but when, and then ask yourself, whose time is being centered here? Whose time is being ignored? And whose futures are being defended or abrogated? So we will begin in a Himalayan village. Gar, home, life in a Himalayan village, offers a quiet portrait of village life, not as nostalgia, but as lived reality. What we see is how continuity is maintained through daily practice and remaining accountability to place. Muni is our narrator, and she contemplates her home in the Indian Himalayas while reflecting on the delicate dance between continuity and social change. What we witness is continuity under pressure. It's a way of imagining the future that insists education, movement, and aspirations must remain in relationship with land, memory, and responsibility. This is Sanskrit futures at scale of everyday life.
मेरा नाम है कुमारी मुन्नी मुन्नी नेगी और मेरी फैमिली में 7 सदस्य हैं। 3 भाई हैं और 2 बहनें। गांव की ना मतलब गांव ऐसे है, गांव में हर किसी का सुख दुख हर चीज दिखा जाता है। हर चीज देखो आप एकदम शुद्ध है, पानी शुद्ध, हवा शुद्ध, जो भी है। बाहर देखो गाड़ियों हर चीजों से, यहाँ तक भीड़ भाड़ चलते बहुत गाड़ी चलती, अनेक बीमारी से देवी देवता का वास नहीं होता, पर यहाँ हर चीज मतलब संतुलन है। पौराणिक चीजों पे बहुत मेहनत लगाओ है। पौराणिक चीजों पे जैसे पहले जमाने के क्या करते थे, क्या ऐसी चीजों पे बहुत लगा, अपने पुराना इतिहास जानने का बहुत। इसी के साथ मेरा 2 साल का गैप हुआ, घर का काम किया, पूरा मतलब जो भी होता खेती बाड़ी से लेकर हर चीज किया, और मम्मी पापा को भी देखा, घर में भाई बहनों को भी देखा, और अपनी परिस्थिति के अनुसार फिर अब मेरा BA में एडमिशन लिया है। अब देखती हूँ पढ़ाई करने जा रही हूँ, क्या क्या होता है। मेरे पापा बहुत अच्छे हैं, वो हमारे बारे में बहुत सोचते हैं, दोनों बहनों के बारे में। कुछ लोग यहाँ कहते हैं शादी कर दो, पापा कहते नहीं, मैं शादी में ना अपने बेटे को पढ़ाऊंगा।
पढ़ाई इसलिए जरूरी है कि क्योंकि अगर पढ़ाई नहीं होगी तो फिर जो है लड़कियां पीछे हो जाएंगी, इसलिए जो है कि लड़कों के बराबर आने के लिए पढ़ाई जो है जरूरी है। कि पढ़ाई कोई नौकरी के पर्पज से नहीं, जो है कि शिक्षा के स्तर से जो है कि नौकरी मिले ना मिले उसे कोई मतलब नहीं, लेकिन शिक्षित होना जरूरी है। तो मुझे इसलिए जो है कि सिर्फ घर की भी चिंता रहती कि घर में भी काम जरूरी है, पढ़ाई भी जरूरी है, तो दोनों चीजों करना जरूरी है।
घर में रखने रूम ले रखा है, काम हो तो मतलब चली जाती हूँ नीचे, मतलब काम के हिसाब से लगी रहती हूँ, ऊपर और नीचे बस सही यही लगे रहेगा, ऊपर नीचे बस। जैसे घर के लिए हाँ इतना खुश होता है आज घर आ रही, वहाँ कहीं ना हाँ जाऊंगी कल परसों, बस ऐसे लगी रहती हूँ। लगता है मेरा तो नहीं लगता उतना मन, ऐसे ही बस घर वालों की जबरदस्ती से तो एडमिशन ले लिया, फिर इच्छा भी थी ना मैं पढ़ लूंगी, हो गई। इस शादी भी हो जाएगी तो इस गांव को छोड़ के ले दूसरे गांव में जाना, तो ससुराल में तो कुछ अलग ही करना पड़ता है। आज यहाँ घूमने के लिए आए थे तो सास ससुर के साथ ऐसा नहीं होगा, हाँ भाई ये काम करना तो करना, वो हमने मतलब करना ही करना कि मेरी फ्रेंड लोग कहते ना कि यार मुन्ने ऐसे तो नहीं होता ससुराल में कुछ अलग ही होता है, यहाँ लगी मैं कहती क्या अलग होता है कि हाँ जब तू ससुराल जाएगी तभी पता चलेगा बड़ा। मेरी साथी है ये, उसका सपना है कि जो ऐसा पति मिले जो मुझे बाहर ले जाए, है उसका सपना है। भाई मैंने पूछा भाई ऐसा क्यों, भले बल वहाँ ऐसे बल अपना बल ऐसे खाओ बल ऐसे मतलब ऐसे जीवन यापन नहीं करना पड़ेगा जैसे माता पिता ने किया। ये ऐसे अपनी जन्मभूमि को छोड़ के मैं कैसे जा सकती हूँ? नहीं हम छोड़ ही नहीं सकते, बल्कि मैंने कहा मुझे बहुत लगाओ पौराणिक चीजों से, मुझे बहुत लगाओ, थोड़ा शिक्षित होने के नाते थोड़ा अलग अलग करना चाहती हूँ मम्मी से, थोड़ा ना एक गुना बढ़ती। पर मम्मी ने ये काम किया वो किया मुझे बहुत अच्छा लगता, क्योंकि अगर हम खेती बाड़ी नहीं करते तो हम खाते कैसे पीते कैसे, मतलब कुछ हम कर ही नहीं सकते, यहाँ आने का कोई साधन ही है ही नहीं, खेती बाड़ी ना करो तो कुछ साधन नहीं है। मतलब घर में भी बहुत चिंता होती है, कल के दिन क्या होगा ऐसे मतलब चिंता होती रहती है। और पढ़ाई के लिए जा रही हूँ तो खर्चा कहाँ से आएगा, मतलब अपनी घर से और बाहर के लोगों से भी मतलब बहुत चिंता रहती है। खाली वो जाएगा मेरा मतलब जो शरीर में है ना वही बात, दिल तो ही है कि मैं अपने गाँव में।
That's Gar, home. It's not a point on the map, not a place that you go to. It's something you carry forward. Mooney's future is imagined through continuity, not against it. The film insists it's not tradition versus modernity either. The future must accommodate the rhythms that sustain life. To abandon them would be rupture, the very concept of which Gar, home, cannot survive. Gar shows us not a refusal of possible futures, but a refusal of rupture. The Sanskrit futures here are not abstract. They are woven into everyday action. It is the arduous path of carrying your world with you. This is the profound revelation of temporal sovereignty at the heart of this documentary. The futures Mooney imagines are done so through continuity, through memory, land, and obligation carried forward. The question, of course, is what happens when this long time continuity is no longer left alone? Mine, Story of a Sacred Mountain, and the 2-year follow-up clip, Strength in Numbers, Tribe versus Corporation, both produced by Survival International, tell the story of the Dangriya Khan, an indigenous community in Odisha, India, for whom the Nayamgiri Hills are a living deity, not a resource, not even nature, God. What you witness is not simply a conflict between mining and conservation. That generally ends badly. It is a collision between two temporal worlds. I invite you to listen not just for what is said, but how time itself is being imagined.
mati lampu, dole mati lampu, kuyang mati lampu, arta mati lampu, katinggi lampu, dulungki lampu, hanya jenis skill kunau bisi, kanggau bisi, kabang bisi, hanya jenis skill. Horu gratis ayu mera, anak mera, kuna tari kat mera, amo horu kati nang tari, horu mana horu kati si amo kati uhi, piko dole kangki si. Kanga kabang bisi prati kitinggi na. Ada itu nama.
Sabu, amar baat sabu bolisi, amar number number. Ebe di, dekhe di. Ye salpa kato oti, salpa kato track koruti, ame duma heruti. Konda kadri tille, seka duma hoiti. Ame niyam giri, sabu pani batba, water pani, sabu.
Edi banaki kunata mahaya. Ala tidak seputar haya ada dalam minat mengebut ski dan anak ski. Pelun sini, udah sini berani. Aku yuri seputar setan abu ne terus sih mbak ne tu puja lagi lah. Aji tak puja lagi lah. Haya mungkin haya dari seputar haya ini dan nak aji tak ne lagi lah puja ini.
Bedang dongar kulu pani suki jiwa. हम समस्ते हमरो नियागिरी पहाड़ अछि बाघ अछि बालु अछि माखड़ अछि बारा अछि सोमते जंतु जीव साइते हम मिसी कर रहिछि से कुटर पानी पीबो हम कुटर पानी पीबो डंगर बेदान को मोटे तागु नै खूब बटर खुल्ला मत हम चाहते मोटे नियागिरी पानी बेदान छुईबा को दरकार नै
ଆମେ କଦଳୀ ଅଛି କନ୍ଦା ଅଛି ସବୁ ଫଳ ମୋର କେତେ ପ୍ରକାର ଫଳ ଅଛି ସେ ଫଳ ଆମେ ଦେଇପାରିବ ସେ ମାଗିଆ
हमें मैदान के दरकार नहीं बच्चे देव नहीं सब असुविधा है हमारे डंगर पहाड़ से हम पर्वत के लिए सब असुविधा से खाना पीना सब अच्छी इटे उतर नेले आमे खेती लोग अच्छी उतर दिले का आमे को बिला दिले का आमे बची पार को डंगर पहाड़ सब बची पार को वर्षा आसबो से पवन आसबो शीत आसबो सब तास बास है पड़े उतर सब पानी नेले आमे मरिजी सेति बा आम नियमगिरी पाई आम जीवन दे
Rejected to Vedanta's plans to mine for bauxite in Orissa. It's as flat and no as you can get. No discussion. Just no way.
ଆମର ମାଟି ଆମେ ସାରବା ଖାଇବ ନାହିଁ ଆମର ଗଛ ପତ୍ର ଆମେ ସାରବା ଖାଇବ ନାହିଁ ଜଙ୍ଗଲ କେତେ ସୁନ୍ଦର ଥିଲେ କା ଆମର ପାଣି ପବନ ପଡବ
ଆମର ଜିତଲା ବୋଲି ଗୋଟେ ଥର ଯାଇଲି ଆମକୁ ଏବେ ଶକ୍ତି ଲାଗିଲା ଆମର ନିୟମ ବତଲା ବୋଲି କରି
ନମସ୍କାରୀ କରି ଯାଅ ବୋଲି କରିବେ ତାଙ୍କେ ଜୁତିଲା ଯେ ଆମର ଲୋକ ଆସୁଛେ ଜୀବନ ଦେବା ପାଇଁ ବୋଲି କରି କେନ୍ତା ଲାଗଲା ଜୀବନ କଲେ ଲାଗୁଛେ ଏକା
ଆମର ରାଜ୍ୟ ପରା କୋଉ ରାଜ୍ୟ ଗଲେ ମିଶା ସେ ରାଜ୍ୟ ମିଳିବ ନାହିଁ ସେମିତି ଆମ ଡଙ୍ଗିଆ ମାନଙ୍କୁ ଆରେ ବାହାର ଲୋକ ସମସ୍ତେ ରହିଲାକୁ ଆମକୁ ଟିକେ ଶକ୍ତି ଆସିଲା ଆଜ୍ଞା ଆମକୁ ଟିକେ ଦେହ ଟିକେ ଭଲ ଲାଗିଲା ଆମେ ମିଶା ଲଢ଼ି ନାହିଁ ପ୍ରତ୍ୟେକ ଲୋକ ଲଢ଼ୁଛି ଆମର ପ୍ରାଣ ପାଇଁ ସେମିତି ଆମ ଜୀବନ ପାଇଁ ସେମିତି ଲଢ଼ାଇ କରୁଛୁ ବୋଲି ଆମେ ଧନ୍ୟବାଦ ଦେବୁ
This was not a victory of activism over capitalism. It was a temporal alignment of fast systems confronting a time horizon that refused to move. Who has the right and or obligation to define the future? The Dangriya Khan or Vendetta? That was the question. For the Dangriya Khan, the Niyamgiri is not an object to be consumed in any development timeline. It is a living presence, ancestor, deity, and obligation, binding past, present, and future together. This is what temporal sovereignty looks like in practice. A community insisting that its future cannot be reduced to profit calculations, extraction schedules, or external timelines imposed from elsewhere. This is also a concrete example of what I mean by Sanskrit futures. The Dangriya Khan do not imagine the future as a blank slate to be optimized or exploited. They understand it as an unfolding of karmic and ancestral relationship where the mountain itself is part of the moral community. In that sense, the future here is not something to be predicted or extracted. It is something to be held in balance. This is not resistance to the future. It is resistance to a rigged future and a demand for a future shaped by responsibility, relationship, and moral community. But what happens if Sanskrit futures are denied, overwritten, or fragmented? I want to end this story that begins underwater, but not due to sea level rise, at least not directly. Coral Woman follows Uma Mani, an artist from Tamil Nadu who spent years painting coral reefs she'd never seen. Her fascination with corals came from an intuitive sense that something precious and fragile existed beyond everyday sight, something already under pressure. What Uma could see what was happening on land: industrial waste, polluted runoff, untreated sewage, all flowing into the sea. Long before she ever put on a diving mask, she understood that what we do upstream, on shore, and in cities does not stay there. It accumulates, slowly and invisibly, in the marine ecosystem. The film is about arriving late to a future already altered and choosing to take responsibility anyway.
Jumping from the boat, I was a bit nervous. I was a bit worried. The cold water really enveloped me and accepted me. I saw big corals full of fishes. They were all swimming around me, colorful fishes. moving from left to right, like a ballad. Colors, oh my God, you had a rate of colors. I didn't know that they serve a very great purpose and their presence in the oceans are very important. I didn't know until then. Only a documentary changed my, the whole idea. And then we watched more films. I spoke to many divers. From 2010, I started painting the coral. I never had an idea as to I'd be diving in my lifetime. No, not even swimming. Somebody saw this painting and told me, have you taken a closer look at the coral? So I thought it's high time. I dived and found these corals myself. At the age of 49, I learned swimming. That was my obsession.
After seeing corals for real, did it make any change in your painting?
Yes. Coral reefs has fishes and fishes need corals. That is the one big truth I understood. So I just added fishes to all my paintings later, even the older ones.
You might be seeing corals from underwater. But if you see the prehistoric data, you can see corals in the land. These are the buildings which were built in the 14th century or 15th century during the Portuguese, Danish periods, and then followed by British. They developed it for a port to do the maritime trade of pearls. In those days there were no bricks, no muds, because it is a coastal area. So it is built of coral. See, if this much corals has been taken out, imagine how much corals will be there, how much rich this land might be, how much loot has been.
Visualize a beautiful reef with all this coral underwater, with fishes swimming around.
Now there is no more.
I've never dived in India, so this is my first dive. So eagerly waiting for it. Looks so blue and beautiful outside. Go underwater, it is like a desert. The coral reefs were as big as an elephant. It could have taken years, even centuries to grow to that level. Most of them are dead and some of them are bleached. It is like a graveyard underwater.
Climate change is not what we can control locally. It needs global attention and global initiatives. whatever the mistakes the whole world is doing, we are facing the consequences.
And I used to tell you, நான் காணும் உலகங்கள் நீ காண வேண்டும். I want you to dive and see this beautiful underwater. It was a beautiful experience, Priya. You should also experience it.
Very powerful film. Umamani intuitively understood that the epic time scale of coral growth when she observed coral heads the size of elephants. Rachel Carson, in her book The Edge of the Sea, observed that coral reefs operate on deep time. Carson observed tidal pool creatures adapted to rhythms measured in millennia. Coral colonies alive today that began forming before there were industrial civilizations. But corals are also extremely sensitive to even small shifts in temperature and chemistry. Uma's art and activism functions as a form of ethical ventriloquism. She lends her voice to speak for the coral. And in doing so, speaks not only for the damaged ecosystems, but for unborn humans and non-human aquatic life, whose futures are already being narrowed, if not foreclosed. Umamani's story matters because it reminds us that climate change is not just a failure of foresight, it is often a failure of timing. Here, temporal sovereignty extends beyond human communities to include the right of ecosystems themselves to continue across epochs. When she invited the film director Priya out to see the reef, with her sense of awe and wonder, she told Priya, "You must see the world I've seen." In this statement, there is hope. These three documentaries encounter different ways of holding the future open, from the quiet continuity of land, home, and community, to the defense of a sacred mountain, to the moral reckoning that arrives when deep time is finally made visible. So I want to bring these paths together and set them against a dominant story of time that we are unfortunately living in. Taken together, the films offer a gift, interconnected ways of walking in time. Each of the pathfinders refuses the idea that frontline communities are passive victims of change. Instead, they are skilled navigators of temporal complexity. This stands in stark contrast to a recent satirical film called Don't Look Up. Any of you seen it? Okay, good. You got a good idea about it. So Don't Look Up tells the story of two astronomers who discovered a comet on a collision with Earth. Yet, in a single news cycle, public attention has moved on. People are told, quite literally, just don't look up. The threat is known. Oh, excuse me, I jumped ahead a little bit too far. From a futures perspective, the film is not about ignorance, it's about temporal dysfunction. The threat is known, the projections are clear, the science is credible, and yet meaningful action never appears. Don't Look Up dramatizes how society can clearly perceive an existential threat and still fail to act. In other words, it is a portrait of a civilization trapped inside a self-consuming present. Our South Asian documentarians offered a different portrait, stories of orientation. These communities know exactly where they stand in time, in relation to the mountain, to the rivers, to land and ocean, to ancestors and descendants. Don't Look Up shows us what happens when foresight fails, to be a verb. The Pathfinders, however, show us what it looks like when temporal responsibility is practiced, even under pressure. Okay, I can't help it, another poem. One of my favorite poems is Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. And often it's been misinterpreted as I chose wisely and it worked out, okay? But one of the things that Frost shows us is how easily uncertainty is converted after the fact into a comfortable story of choice. The poem gives us a deceptively simple image of a fork in the road, a moment where a decision must be made before consequences could be known. Frost opens his poem with this observation. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. What matters here is not the choice itself, but the uncertainty. The speaker looks ahead as far as possible as the path disappears from view. A decision must be made without a clear view of what the future path might reveal. In this uncertainty, I imagine that the speaker channels Donald Rumsfeld. There are the known knowns that provide confidence. There are the known unknowns that insert doubt. But the unknown unknowns confound the decision. Lacking friction, a quick decision is made, and it forecloses all other options. Frost's poem ends not with certainty, but with narration. I shall tell this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. What Frost captures here so precisely is how meaning is often assigned after the fact. That is how society tells stories, smoothing uncertainty into inevitability. In this final section, I want to name the conditions that we're living in, the strange, disorienting overlap of collapsing systems and emerging futures, and I want to offer a call to action. So let's get into it. We need a language for naming this current time, but what should it be called? Well, Homi K. Bhabha, have you heard of him? Oh, good, great. He gives us the concept of a time lag, a liminal space. Also, he calls it a third space, in which the old order has lost its legitimacy, but the new one has not yet fully taken shape. Zayed Sadar describes our present era as one of post-normal times, when systems that once appeared stable enter terminal crisis. Sound familiar? Okay, I'll leave it there. When the present, as he puts it, begins to chaotically consume all futures. Put together, these ideas give us a powerful diagnosis. We are living in a time of rupture, a state of temporal liminality, suspended between collapsing temporal orders and emerging fractals of fragile alternatives. However, the danger of remaining in this liminal space is paralysis. We become stuck on a feedback loop oscillating between nostalgia for a world that no longer is and doom scrolling towards futures we feel powerless to challenge. The temptation in moments like this is either to cling to the old or retreat into cynicism. However, the pathfinders we've encountered today suggest another possibility. They show us that liminality can also have a different meaning. It doesn't have to be a rift. It can be a space of practice, a space in which we exercise temporal sovereignty, holding fast to long-term commitments, even as larger systems destabilize around us. Another way of understanding this is to notice that we are living across systems that experience time very differently. Much of our media, online social channels, and economic life is organized to move with as little resistance as possible. Faster circulation, seamless scaling, minimal delay. Ecological systems don't work that way. They depend on resistance and rhythm, on limits, recovery time, and the slow work of regeneration. When systems designed to move without resistance are allowed to govern worlds that survive only through contrast, that result is not efficiency, it's exhaustion. So the question becomes, what does this look like for us concretely, for media studies and for cultural studies? Let me be very clear. The response to post-normal paralysis is not a new development plan. Far from it. I'm advocating a practice of temporal sovereignty as a polyvalent grounding approach, rooted in place, relationship, and long-term responsibility, including the deliberate introduction of friction, where life requires thoughtful care rather than speed. Temporal sovereignty appears in different forms in the film we've watched, sustaining continuity through everyday practice, maintaining home and land, and livelihood in the face of slow environmental and social change, refusing the sacrifice of sacred land for short-term profit, asserting some places are not resources but responsibilities that must endure across generations, and speaking on behalf of deep time, lending voice to coral reefs and future oceans that are already being damaged by decisions made elsewhere and long ago. Importantly, our role is not to replace these practices. Our role is to walk alongside, to learn from the pathfinders, and to help clear the obstacles that stand in the way of their and our preferred futures. It's the humans in the lead, not just humans in the loop. To do that well, we need to think carefully about something very close to our daily work in media and cultural studies, something that we sometimes get a little bit cavalier about: representation. Stuart Hall reminds us that representation is not a mirror. It is a practice, one that actively shapes meaning, power, and possibility. Stuart Hall also, I got carried away. For decades, well-intentioned documentaries about Indigenous and marginalized communities have often reproduced familiar frames that Fabian would recognize. Communities as victims, as objects of global concern, as people out of normal time without a future who need saving. This is the old politics of temporal representation. The new politics I'm advocating, as the films we've seen today model, does something very different. framing communities not as stranded in the present, but as pathfinders in time, as custodians of sophisticated temporal knowledge, as co-authors of preferred futures rather than subjects of other people's plans. GAR recognizes everyday continuity as a form of futures work. Mine treats sacred land not as a resource, but as an intergenerational responsibility. Coral Woman acknowledges ethically advocating for ecosystems across time. This shift may sound subtle, but its implications are profound for how we teach media and cultural studies, for how we curate festivals, symposia, and conferences such as this one, for how we fund research projects and support film collaborations. If we are serious about the theme of this conference, resilience and renewal, tradition, innovation, and media futures in South Asia, then we owe the Pathfinders a new politics of representation, and this is not optional. It is the mechanism by which tradition and innovation are braided into futures work. Let me end with this. I want to offer three invitations, three ways to carry this work forward after we leave this room. First, adopt the compass. Engage with tradition and the future. Let the 7 generations principle and the South Asian cognates become disciplining lenses for your work. When you design a syllabus, what future does this prepare the students for? When you plan a project, how might this matter to people 7 generations from now? When you choose what to amplify, ask, whose temporal sovereignty am I supporting? Remember what this actually means in time. We're talking about descendants living in the 22nd century. 7 generations thinking asks us to refuse decisions that would quietly foreclose their preferred futures before they're even born. Second, champion the new politics. Innovate media futures. Innovation here is not first about technology. It's about narrative, ethics, and responsibility. Shift your framing from vulnerability to pathfinding. Treat Indigenous and local communities not as case studies, but as co-theorists and participants, partners in the future. Use your films, your articles, your classrooms to clear the path, to make these temporal practices more visible, more legible, and more respected. Third, cultivate Sanskrit futures. Weave it together in South Asian studies. This region, with its dharmic philosophies, indigenous knowledge systems, and long histories of struggle and renewal, holds extraordinary potential to model alternative temporalities for the world. Imagine climate action that centers not only on emissions and emission targets, but on temporal justice as well. If we do this, if we become path clearers, then our work in media and cultural studies will be more than commentary. It will be part of the weaving. I conclude with a reminder from Buckminster Fuller. We are called to be the architects of the future, not its victims. Kitsiaya Yaxkalo. Do you have any questions or reflections?
Questions? Comments?
Sure. Would you like to pick someone with their hand up, Dr. Ogden? Or do you want to pick someone with a...
Yeah, okay.
It's interesting that I was just thinking about Bucky Fuller when you showed that as the last slide. I had him as a freshman in college as a professor, visiting professor, and one of the things that sticks in my memory is at the end of like a 4-hour lecture, he kind of summed it up and said, if we would take all the money and creativity that goes into advertising and war, we could solve every problem in the world in 10 years. And that was 60 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I think it really resonates because he was talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate your taking us through this experience so that we can continue that experience, as you said, in our media work, in our classes, and whatever it is we choose to do.
Inshallah, inshallah. Thank you. In the back over there.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experiences. I'm from Mexico, and your presentation brought to me a lot of nostalgia because I grew up with my mom going to the Indigenous location and doing research on folklore. And so my point is that I do work with a lot of professors in Latin America. Have you considered doing something similar just to reflect how the 7 generations principle is what we used to kind of rule our lives by our ancestors?
Okay. If you asked a question, I didn't have these in my ears, so I had a hard time hearing you. Okay. For some strange reason, it decided to play music. So I will put that off. Okay. What was the question?
The question is, if you have considered going to other indigenous cultures in somewhere else, like in Latin America, to just reflect and exhibit the same 7 generations principle that you observe in India, but it's also happening, and it can be the same principle that ruled our ancestors in previous generations and previous civilizations.
Right. I get that. Yeah. I did a lot of my work in the Pacific Islands, and the Pacific Islands are probably the people closest to the climate problem. In fact, Tuvalu is actually making arrangements with Australia, but they want to keep the sovereignty of their islands after they sink because they're only about 6 feet above water. So they're doing this generational thinking about when our islands are no longer able to be occupied, where are we going to go? And so Australia is giving them some space. And here's the interesting thing. They're going to keep their islands as their territory. They're becoming a virtual nation. And the big reason behind that is to keep people from exploiting the resources surrounding their islands. So that's one way that they're engaging in that 7-generation principle. They're thinking way ahead, and they're doing some really amazing stuff. So did that help?
Yeah, and I think that we can see other examples like the Galapagos Islands, but still the people can bring examples of how if this is not approached at a global level, then the impact may still have making some damage.
Yeah, that is a possibility. But the folks in Tuvalu, I've been to Tuvalu. I was doing part of a study that was going to inform the Bush 1 administration of what the islands wanted. What they wanted was to have the borrow pits filled in. These were things that were scooped up off their atoll to build a runway during World War II, and then they just never put it back. They just said, just put the dirt back into the borrow pits because there's lots of mosquitoes and stuff like that. And the funny thing is that they sent water catchment tanks and didn't do anything else. So they were very upset about that. And so they had other plans that they worked in. At that time, the president was Bikini Bu, and he was a friend of mine. And we were able to put together a plan that allowed them to refill the borrow pits with the Australian Navy. They came out and then pumped it in, sort of like what Dubai does when they make islands in the middle of the Gulf. They just pump sand up until it's high enough to build on. And they've been nurturing that for quite a while, but it's the problems are they're on the front line of the ocean, and it's predicted that if we don't slow or stop, those islands will be probably about 10 to 20 feet underwater, depending on how severe things are. But yeah, thank you. I kind of rambled a little bit, sorry.
Time for about one more question, I believe. Perfect.
Hi, I'm Flavia Ramos Matusi. My question is more curiosity than about the topic, but now that I have the mic, I can ask anything, I guess. I was in Tuvalu about 12 years ago, and I was with a colleague, and we were doing work on education, or actually, we were there during the cyclone season, not the best place to be there, and the schools were closed, so it was like word of mouth that we can get people to talk to and interview teachers. But there are 9 little islands, an archipelago. So we are in the main island, and you could not travel to the other ones because no boats were going to get out of the island. But at the time, we were walking around, and you saw a lot of landfill. Like area is a volcanic island, so nothing can be underground. Everything's above ground. And walking around, you see these silos of water donated by European Union, USAID, all different international donors. They don't have water. And I heard at that time that they had asked to move, I think they asked different governments, New Zealand and Australia, but they want to move themselves entirely as a population, not go into several different countries, but go to one place where they can build their own community, their civilization. So, and I heard at that time that was denied. So what you're telling me now is great news. So thank you for that, because I still have great memories of the people of Tuvalu.
Oh, very good, yeah. One of the things I didn't mention, but the islands will become impossible to live on. Not because they've sunk, but from the salinization of their freshwater lands. And I remember witnessing some of that in Majuro in Marshall Islands. So it was not a good thing.
And that's my other question. Please do not take this question as a criticism. This is a wonderful presentation. But I see a lot of AI-generated pictures, and they take so much energy to produce. So that's another thing. I'm not a concern that I use AI all the time. So it's another concern that we have. And my daughter refuses to use anything AI because she's more worried about the environment than what she can get done using AI. So that's another thing to think about.
Yeah, the amount of water that is used to cool the data sites is astronomical, and I am not a very good artist, and I didn't have a lot of photos that would go with the thing. So thank you, ChatGPT, for helping me generate the graphics. However, the ones you see here, those are my photos. When I was doing preparatory work for a documentary on the Parsi in Mumbai. So I guess I can conclude now and basically say Shukriya, Dhanyavad, Nanri, Kityayo. Thank you.
Two quick announcements before we break up. There's a flyer on the back table that outlines the program for the rest of the conference. It's not an outline, but it gives you the sources where you can tap into the presentations tomorrow, including the second keynote address that will be after lunch, which will be the final event. The second announcement, I think some of you have already discovered, there's a wonderful set of posters in the hallway outside this lecture room. They're produced by Nahal, graduate student in international education and policy, and pictures of his work in Nepal, which accompany a wonderful book that has just been published, which he is going to present a bit tomorrow at the lunch and be able to answer questions about his development over many years in Nepal. So I hope you can attend that. Michael, again, thank you for just a very profound and provocative talk. I just want to quote my friend Tom Taylor. For me, and perhaps for many of you, it was more than a talk, it was an experience. You know, the cases and your reflections on time. I can't think about time again without remembering this lecture and some of the points you made.
Good.
So thank you again.
You're welcome. Thank you, everybody.